Welcome to this Asia Global podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. Subscribe to Asia Global Online, our weekly digital journal, by going to the Asia Global Online or the Asia Global Institute website. And follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. In this podcast, we are joined from Tokyo, Japan by University of Virginia Professor of Politics, Leonard Schoppa. Len's research examines the politics and political economy of Japan in comparative context. In particular, he looks at the political economy of low fertility rates in Japan. His 2006 book, Race for the Exits, and a 2020 article explored aspects of that. He has recently been examining how the level of residential mobility afforded by housing markets affects civic engagement at the local level in Japan and the United States. This has resulted in an article as well as a documentary film, Slow Way Home, broadcast in 2016, that focused on the phenomenon of how young children go to and from school and the trust, care, and vigilance of the communities around them. He is working on a book related to that, a book that looks at how local areas maintain the livability of their communities. He edited The Evolution of Japanese Party Politics, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2011. Earlier in his career, he focused on aspects of the political economy of Japan and the United States, including trade bargaining. His doctorate in politics is from the University of Oxford, which is where we met. We were, in fact, next door neighbors for a year. And he has been at the University of Virginia at UVA since 1990. So welcome, Len. It's wonderful to have you as our guest.
Great to join you.
Great. Now, let me launch into our discussion, which is we're going to talk about Shinzo Abe, Abe Shinzo, the longest serving prime minister of Japan, and who was assassinated just last week in a shocking development, really, something that one would never or wouldn't expect in Japan. So tell us, you're right there in Tokyo. The funeral of Abe Shinzo was yesterday. What's the atmosphere like? What's the mood of the public? And what are your own reflections of the moment?
So when the assassination happened a couple of days ago, I was still in Hokkaido in the city of Sapporo. So on those days immediately after the event, I was talking to people there, and I just arrived in Tokyo yesterday. Haven't had as many chances to talk to people here, but what everyone says when they talk about the event is how literally they use the exact same word you did, shocking, right? I think this is particularly so in Japan because it has been many, many years since Japan faced any gun attacks on one of their politicians, even when they did have an assassination of a Socialist Party leader back around 1960, it was a knife attack, right? So these, in last year, there was only one gun murder in the entire country. So for Japanese to wrap the mind around the fact that there was a gun attack and it actually killed the prime minister this time is really difficult. And I think it has delayed a lot of the reflective thinking about what does this mean? What does the passing of Prime Minister Abe mean for the future of Japanese politics? There's a lot of focus on the events of the assassination. Why was this guy building his own gun and attacking the prime minister? And I think that's natural. but again, distracts from thinking about the fact that here we see the passing of probably the most influential politician of the last 20 years, certainly. Certainly ranks along with prime ministers like Koizumi and Nakasone as the most influential prime ministers in post-war Japan. And he was still quite young. He's only 67. Many people in Japan lived to 90 or beyond. He had ahead of him many years to be a kingmaker, someone who would influence events. And now suddenly he's off the stage. And that no doubt is going to redirect Japanese politics.
And indeed, it seems like the motive, at least what little we know at the moment, of the attacker was, in some ways, he thought that Abe was related or connected to a group, supposedly the Moonies, at least the Unification Church, and that his mother lost some money. But so it wasn't, there doesn't seem to have been any sort of political motive there. But let's talk about Abe the politician, because I think I've read some articles that in some ways called him Trump before Trump, because you can't get to be prime minister of Japan, and certainly you can't get to stay as long as he did. And he was there 2 terms, because he was there, as I recall, 2006 to 2007. Yep. And then again from 2012 to 2020.
Yeah.
So that's really the unprecedented longevity. So he was he a bruiser, a political bruiser? I mean, he comes from a long line of politicians. His grandfather was, in fact, a prime minister, and his father was also a Liberal Democrat, an LDP LDP stalwart. So politics was in his blood. Well, what was he like as a politician?
Well, I think that you've seen some of a bifurcation in people's response, and when they write articles after his passing, because he did set out to be a strong leader. He had many years to focus on watching other people up close in leadership roles. That started with his grandfather, Kishi Nobusuke, who was prime minister in the 1950s. So around the time he was a boy, he would have had a chance to see his own grandfather playing this role. And then he saw his father, Abe Shintaro, who served as foreign minister in the 1980s and was on his way to being prime minister himself until he died of cancer. So he has literally been front row seat watching one prime minister after another, most of them failing, flaming out after 1 year. He himself experienced being in the office and flaming out after 1 year. He could have stayed after that year because the party still had control of the lower house. He wasn't voted out, but he decided when they had lost an upper house election and he no longer had the ability to easily accomplish legislative aims, that his ulcers were too severe and he needed to step down.
Right.
And so he had time to reflect on that as well. By 2012, another 5 years has passed and he's watched 6 prime ministers.
Right.
5 more prime ministers come and go during that time.
Right.
So I'm probably on the side that gives him more credit for figuring out how to exercise continuous leadership for 8 years, as opposed to criticizing him for maybe stretching the boundaries in certain ways that helped him do that. Because he did both completely legitimate, smart things to do this, as well as stretching the boundaries, things that upset a lot of progressives in Japan and some progressive critics around Asia and even in the United States. So I can talk about both of those things,
Right.
the legitimate things as well as maybe the things that got him criticized. But shall we do that next?
Right. No, in fact, what are some of these? I guess let's start with the legitimate things, because that's always good to be a bit positive. So,
yeah,
what were some of those things that he did right, in your view?
Well, you know, the Prime Minister's office in Japan has traditionally been quite weak compared to the British Prime Minister, for example, and many Japanese politicians of various stripes have set out to try to achieve something like the prime ministerial leadership that you see in Britain to achieve the Westminster model.
Although maybe not the current prime minister situation. Right
yes, now. Yes, we won't go there. That's not today's topic.
Right.
But the ability for Prime Minister Abe to exercise stronger leadership was made possible in part by electoral reforms that were adopted in the 1990s that made single member districts a bigger part of their election system, fostering more of a two-party system, giving the prime minister a little more influence and reducing the role of faction bosses. So, you know, other prime ministers get credit for pushing through these kinds of institutional changes that enabled stronger leadership. But somebody had to come along and figure out how to exercise these new powers that were put in place through institutional reforms. And Abe took full advantage of the election system, as well as some steps that were adopted around 2000, prior to Koizumi coming into office, that enabled the Prime Minister's office to grow, to have a cabinet staff that was larger and that could be organized to respond to emergencies and take the leadership in legislative affairs. Prior to 2000, the Prime Minister could not even initiate legislation. If he had a cabinet member who didn't, in the area in which he had some goals, and that cabinet member did not want to initiate legislation, he had to just sit there and wait for him to come along.
Right.
That person was a faction boss rival. They could use that to delay and make him look bad. So this was important, that the Prime Minister gained some ability to have legislative initiative. And that means staffing your cabinet office with good people, experienced in crisis management. So you avoid the kinds of bungling that you saw in the Democratic Party administration, especially after the earthquake. Right. So Abe, in his second term after 2012, took the time, a full year and a half, to get all of his people into positions, focus on the economy, on Abenomics to address the persistent deflation problem in Japan. And before he took on any more controversial legislative initiatives, so getting good people in place, he organized the National Security Council that would enable responding to emergencies more effectively. In his first term as Prime Minister, he pushed through turning the Defense Agency into the Defense Ministry that enabled it to have more coherent long-term strategic planning. So these are all I think, effective, important things that Abe pushed through to exercise stronger leadership. He also had message discipline, which I think you want to see from all good prime ministers. So he appointed Suga Yoshihide at the beginning of his term, the man who succeeded him as prime minister, but spent all of the Abe administration as the loyal lieutenant, taking questions from the press on a daily basis and maintaining message discipline about this is what we're going to focus on. When there were some scandals, which there were during the Abe years, Suga and his team helped change the subject as quickly as possible and get the public to focus on what Abe wanted to focus on. So that too is, I think, legitimate leadership, use of leadership skills to stay in office and achieve legislative goals. So where I'll get to the more critical things, right? So where he
Well,
has been,
yeah,
did you want to ask any more
no,
about?
no. I was just going to say that basically, in some ways, he benefited from having some tools that were uh, afforded him by previous reforms, and then he made best of use of them, and then he got all his ducks in a row, particularly the right people. And I would mention, I guess, the current sitting governor of the Bank of Japan. I think
Right.
Kuroda Haruhiko, and I think that was instrumental in certainly in his Abenomics plan. But yeah, so what were some of the more iffy things, perhaps, that he did? Yeah.
Yeah, so some of the people who are most upset with him are people who work in the press and worry that under Abe, the government was using its leverage a little bit too heavy-handedly to control the message, right? So this included one of his cabinet ministers commenting that the government had to renew television licenses. So wouldn't it be too bad if this other television company, lost its license because of its failure to toe the line on message?
Sounds like the Philippines, actually.
So the message wasn't delivered quite as bluntly as I just did, and it wasn't ever exercised, right? So, but nevertheless, that's troublesome when the government uses its power in that way to try to cow the press. He appointed some people who were very close to him and were critical of the left to the key jobs of governors of the NHK, the National Broadcast Company. And so this is a public broadcaster, but has tried to maintain its independence and balance. And there was some concern that during the Abe years, he pushed them away from taking on any controversial subjects and staying and promoting his own leadership. So I definitely think that this is an area of concern, but I have to say, like probably most Americans who watched Trump operate for 4 years, it's hard to get too upset about what Abe did, because even despite all the things I just mentioned, there are plenty of critical media outlets in Japan. They're able to write stories about scandals and get them before the Japanese public. And there are certainly some other parts of the press that are very supportive of the conservative government and push policy in a conservative direction, but there are also critical voices still quite vocal in the political arena.
And he wasn't calling them enemy of the people or things like that.
No, and
he wasn't using the rhetoric and the
fake news and all of that.
He wasn't delving into fake news and lies. I mean, that wasn't his style. I mean, that kind of thing.
Yeah, obfuscation, trying to avoid providing any information about scandals, changing the subject. These were staples of what he did during the years. So, but I guess the other major criticism is connected to one of his major policy achievements, which was the reinterpreting of Article 9.
Right.
So under Article 9, Japan has for a long time said it can maintain the minimum necessary power, military power, to protect itself, to defend itself. And it had explicitly said since 1954 that it did not have, under the Constitution, the right to come to the aid of an ally, to engage in collective self-defense. So this was, some of the constitutional basis for Japan saying we can't send any troops to Vietnam to fight alongside the Americans. We can't send any. This even came up during the Korean War, right? When which was right after the Constitution was put into place. So after many years of interpreting the Constitution this way, Abe arranged for somebody he knew was sympathetic to his point of view from the foreign ministry to be appointed kind of very irregularly in the personnel process to the top position in a bureaucratic agency called the Cabinet Legislation Bureau. And in this, this is the bureau that vets government policy to say whether it's constitutional. Japan doesn't just rely on a Supreme Court to do judicial review years after something has happened. They have an agency that's supposed to stop the government from doing things in the first place by advising the government on what is constitutional. And this agency had long held this line on how to interpret Article 9. As soon as this new person was put into place, in July 2014, Abe was enabled to announce a cabinet decision that said Japan is now able to exercise collective self-defense. It could start to build up the military power to prepare to assist the United States. If a United States naval vessel came under attack in the South China Sea, for example, and the Japanese maritime self-defense forces were nearby, now they would be able to help, because according to the new interpretation, if Japan failed to defend its most important ally in that kind of a situation, this could undermine the whole alliance at a critical moment and leave Japan totally exposed and unable to defend itself. So in the name of defending itself, the new interpretation said it should be able to exercise collective self-defense. And this was, something that the Americans had been encouraging the Japanese to do for a long time. Abe had wanted to do it through constitutional revision, actually changing the constitution to explicitly say collective self-defense is allowed. But he relies, the LDP relies on support of the Komeito Buddhist political party in Japan. They didn't always need their seats to hold a majority, but they certainly needed their seats to get to 2/3 of both houses of the legislature, which has to pass a constitutional amendment before it goes to the people, where you need 50% of the voters to approve. So Abe realized that he couldn't get that change through a constitutional revision process, so he organized this reinterpretation. So lots of people think that was not a legitimate way to change Japan's security policy. He couldn't do it through the means of constitutional revision, so he did it through the back door with these kinds of personnel moves. So I think that's something that definitely people disagree about, whether that was an innovative use of leadership skills or whether it was a
maneuver, somewhat of
breaking the norms.
Right.
And I don't think we want to get into the business of comparing leaders in other countries, but it wasn't nearly as bad a norm as certainly sending your supporters with weapons to the Capitol.
Right. So just as a bit of a tangent on that, given the results of last year's election, to the lower house, and then the most recent supermajority that the LDP has won, has that now changed that the equation in terms of if the current Prime Minister Kishida Fumio wants to proceed with that kind of constitution reform? Is this now possible?
So actually, the LDP has had repeatedly 2/3 support in both houses if you include Komeito.
Right.
And that is actually still the constraint.
So Komeito is still in there as a constraint. Right.
It's still it's a constraint in two ways. In most parliamentary systems, you can't pick and choose when to rely on your coalition partner. You come up with a common policy platform and you form a government. And if they don't like a major policy change, they leave your coalition and you could be left shorthanded. So at the moment, they could leave the coalition and LDP would have majorities and it wouldn't fall from Komeito leaving. But it also wouldn't be any closer to accomplishing two-thirds with some new partners. Because there are some new partners out there in the Diet, including the Ishin Party, which has been successful in both of the recent elections, is starting to reach the number of seats that the Constitutional Democratic Party has. So there's now, between two very modest-sized opposition parties, there's a competition to see which is going to be the main opposition.
Right.
And there's a potential for Kishida to say, we're going to ditch Komeito and go with Ishin.
Right.
Okay. And there's another small party, Democratic Party of the People, that also supports some constitutional revisions. That could be part of this. Still doesn't quite get them to two-thirds without Komeito.
All right.
So there's a lot of math involved in figuring out what they can do. So this is what I think is more likely if they are going to push for constitutional revision. They will do a very minimal change to Article 9, which says that the self-defense forces are, that nothing in the previous clauses of Article 9 should be read as inconsistent with the self-defense forces existing.
Right.
The LDP has as their kind of number one bare minimum priority for constitutional revision that the Constitution needs to make it clear that the self-defense forces are constitutional. So this is not much of a, not anything of a policy change, because current constitutional interpretation says that the self-defense forces are constitutional, but it would be a symbolic achievement to get an amendment to Article 9 that at least put the SDF on even firmer constitutional foundations. Now, the Komeito might go along with that as a single modest change in the Constitution and try to put that before the people. It's not clear that the people would vote 50%. So one thing they might do is combine this with a couple more constitutional changes, such as recognizing marriage between people of the same gender. And there's a few other sweeteners that might cause people on the more progressive side and maybe Komeito to support a package. And so that's the kind of thing we may see this fall if Kishida decides to use his sizable majority to actually carry forward a bit of Abe's legacy.
So again, as a slight tangent, the Democratic Party of Japan seems to have really disintegrated to some extent from when it was actually in government. Is that because of Abe, or was it a kind of self-disintegration process? Was it because of Abe's own strength as a leader and what he might have done? What happened there?
I'm glad you brought that up, because even though I was earlier giving Abe quite a bit of credit for holding on to power for 8 years, a lot of that actually had to do with avoiding being tackled by people within his own party. Many previous LDP prime ministers have been pushed aside by people within their own party, and Abe was clearly using a lot of skills to be able to avoid that. He, on the other hand, had a relatively easy time winning elections and holding on to power in competition with opposition parties because of the divisions that you mentioned. One time after another, Abe contested, as soon as he was chosen LDP leader in 2012, he led the party immediately into a lower house election. They had an upper house election the next year. Then they had 2 more lower house elections, and I think 2 more upper house elections. Every single time, Abe prevailed over a very divided opposition party. And so the Democrats, I don't think you can credit Abe too much with dividing the opposition, because they brought it on themselves by performing poorly while they were in office. and fighting among themselves while they were in office, setting in place some cleavages that broke the party apart once they were no longer in office, and people started pointing fingers at each other about who was responsible. And the key figures from the former Democratic Party, made terrible decisions, like right before an election, to try to lead the party into new mergers that weren't fully supported by other members of the party, that suddenly
Right.
split the party right before an election. These are not good things to do,
Right.
and they're all mostly can be blamed on the Democrats. But Abe took full advantage, and when the Democrats in desperation turned to cooperating with the Communist Party last year, of course, this was after Abe was out of office, but eventually the opposition parties did figure out that we're only ever going to start to claw our way back into power if we cooperate, if we avoid running against each other in districts with only one seat, so that LDP versus 3 other candidates is just kind of inviting the LDP to win the seat.
Right.
So they finally started cooperating, even with the communists, to try to run one person in most districts, and that shows the effects of Abe and eventually uniting the opposition parties.
Right. And nothing like a strong leader to kind of unite the opposition against them because they get desperate. You mentioned Abenomics. Not to get too deep into it, but of course there were the 3 arrows of Abenomics: the fiscal policy, the monetary easing, and then the structural reforms, with I think the 3rd arrow of the structural reforms, which included another sort of portmanteau, the womenomics, as part of it. It was also expanding trade relations and things like that under that sort of structural reform. My thinking is that it was a kind of mixed record in terms of hitting the targets with his 3 arrows. What are your thoughts? Because in many ways, I think it was smart, as you said, that he needed to get ducks in a row. So he had to focus on domestic issues if he wanted to have any sort of real progress with Japan abroad. With Japan having a more robust foreign policy, you needed to look after the domestic first. What are your thoughts on where he was with Abenomics?
Sure. So the immediate problem when he came into office was deflation coming back in, because the outgoing party had implemented a increase in the consumption tax at a time when the economy wasn't very strong. It pushed it back into negative growth and negative.
And Japan was always kind of going in and out of positive,
right.
negative, but always kind of stagnant. The lost decade would turn into more than 1 decade.
Right.
Yeah.
So the most important arrow was changing the monetary policy under the new governor of the Bank of Japan that you mentioned, Kuroda, to just do things that were unprecedented in managing the bank affairs, to push interest rates down to the point where they're negative, and do whatever's necessary to make sure everybody understands that the bank wants prices to go up by 2%,
right.
A target of 2% inflation. And in the immediate period when this policy was initiated, it started to go up, the inflation rate, and approach 2%. But it turns out this is not enough to get your economy going on steady growth, that you needed more aggressive policies on the other 2 arrows. So at least he understood that there needed to be others. And he did implement stimulative fiscal policy, with extra money spent on earthquake recovery right after he came into office. So that was part of what got the growth back out of deflation and in the positive growth category within a year. But if you want to go much beyond that and approach the kinds of growth rates that Abe talked about, you needed structural reform. to grow productivity of the Japanese workers. And that was necessitated because Japan has a shrinking number of workers every year because of a long period of low fertility and low immigration. So that if it wants to grow, it has to have positive, strong productivity growth every year. And there's not enough competition in some parts of the Japanese economy to motivate companies to adopt cost-cutting initiatives that will make them more competitive and more productive. The labor market has rigidities that still encourage companies to keep on more workers than they need, which has a social safety net function, but helps keep down Japan's productivity levels. So Abe was talking about the right thing in talking about structural reform, but he ended up doing very little on labor market reform, and instead focused on womenomics and TPP. Okay,
right.
So
as well as corporate governance. I think he had corporate governance, right? I think.
Yeah, but let's talk about TPP first.
Right.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. Initially, he worked with the Obama administration to get this to an agreement with a large group of partners, and he made the difficult decision for a member of a party that used to get a lot of support from farmers to open up all markets eventually under a TPP agreement. And it, of course, included in the short term carve-outs that would protect the most sensitive agricultural sectors.
But he needed to introduce those agriculture reforms. That was a domestic thing that he needed to do, right?
Yeah, and to before those tariffs fell, he could kind of, structural reform could be motivated by farmers realizing that this is coming. You know, we need to get ready for falling tariff rates by figuring out how to do agriculture in a more productive way. And for some people to get out of agriculture entirely and have larger farms. So, but to be able to do that, he needed to enable changes in the way land was regulated so that people could combine plots of land into larger operations, and corporations could get more involved in agriculture, which they had been prevented from. And the very monopolistic agricultural cooperative system, which basically monopolized providing finance, fertilizer, seed, and other things that farmers needed without competition. So that needed to be liberated to have a more vibrant agricultural sector. So he took some small steps in that direction under his administration. Some of the land rules were changed to allow more larger plots, and he took on the center of power of Nokyo, the agricultural cooperatives, the national coordinating politically active body, was targeted for elimination under his reforms, kind of forcing the agricultural cooperatives to go off and do their own thing separately.
Right.
And as a first step, and weakening the ability of the cooperatives to fight back against additional things that the government might do in the future in agricultural reforms. Okay, so but there's still lots of rigidity in the system, and most of the farms are still very small, and the tariff reductions are still looking pretty far off. So this is not the structural reform that's really going to drive productivity improvements across the board in Japan. And I mean, TPP, I support. I wish the Americans would rejoin and be part of this. I think it's the right idea to invest in liberal international economic order in Asia, because the alternative is unthinkable. Right. Military conflict among the most powerful countries in the world. So we should be investing in this, and Abe has wisely stuck to it even after Trump pulled the United States out of the TPP. He brought the rest of the partners along into the new comprehensive and progressive TPP.
Yes, so I was actually a little bit on the sidelines on that one, because of course Canada is part of the TPP, and Abe was, of course, took up the leadership role in trying to get the TPP 11, the without the United States, to conclude what is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnerships, CPTPP, Canada being responsible for the C and the P, let me tell you. But anyway, yeah, and it was a great feat, I think, for the Prime Minister, for Abe to have shepherded everyone to regroup, as it were.
So I'll point to one missed opportunity maybe on following up with that. There was the potential for the Japanese to use the leverage of the fact that now the Canadians and the Australians and the New Zealanders, other cheap agricultural producers, are in the CPTPP, given low tariff rates in Japan. Now this puts the American agricultural interests and some others in a position of needing the Americans to do a deal with the TPP and Japan to get access, at least equal access to the Japanese market. And this kind of a leverage has been used to kind of expand the free trade around the world, leaving a few people out of it until they realize, oh my goodness, we're missing out on a lot of economic opportunity. And they eventually figure out that they need to buy in to liberalization. So Abe relieved Trump of that anxiety by making a separate deal with the Americans to lower tariffs on agricultural goods and a few other things. So, he needed Trump to stay on his side. So I understand why he did that. But, maybe a more forceful pro-free trade leader would have pushed the Americans a little harder.
Yeah, I mean, famously, he was first world leader, wasn't he, to go reach out to Donald Trump over at Trump Tower soon after he was elected, right? And then that was Prime Minister Abe became kind of known as a sort of a Trump whisperer, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in some respects. So let's talk a bit about the womenomics part of it, right?
Sure. So, womenomics is maybe one of his most surprising initiatives, because he eventually bought into the argument that for Japan to grow its economy, it needed all of its working age people to be productive, and that meant bringing women into the full-time workforce in career jobs at much higher rates, in managerial roles at much higher rates. And, Japan actually does pretty well in terms of the proportion of working age women who are in the workforce. The proportion is now 74% or so, right. And it's higher than the United States.
Which is his target. I think he wanted to get up from something like 60, low 60s up to 70 something.
Right, but another of his targets is that he wanted 30% of managers to be women.
Right.
And this was the most ambitious part of the undertaking. And to the credit of key people from Goldman Sachs and so forth who were advising him, who Kathy Matsui,
right,
one of the key people who helped him understand that he needed to do some pushing to get very male-dominated Japanese corporations and government agencies to actively promote making sure their women stayed in their jobs after they had children, and stayed in the fast tracks so that they would be promoted to managerial roles. Whereas the previous system had often pushed them to quit or into part-time temporary positions that kept them in the workforce or brought them back to the workforce after their kids were small, but didn't give them significant responsibilities, didn't pay them well, and allowed companies to have this workforce as a pretty low productivity group on their payroll. So he pushed for these targets of 30%. Some government agencies actually met this target. So the government had more control there. So when they are admitting people right out of college to different government agencies, we started seeing 30% of the incoming class on the managerial track of government agencies were women. And over the long term, that certainly has the potential to change the whole makeup of the Japanese government ministries, because we certainly don't see 30% of the top positions in the government agencies today in the hands of female bureaucrats. But we may someday, because this has been put in place. It's much harder to push corporations to change this. And they tried to announce awards and incentives and sometimes negative shaming to motivate companies to do more in these areas, but they haven't come close to the target. They tried to get to these number 30% by 2020, and they didn't get there.
But I think in the end, they had to, in fact, lower the target, right? Because it just seemed too ambitious, the initial target, right? Which is
and so another unreasonable part of all of his womenomics is he simultaneously announced a target for the fertility rate of 1.8. Okay.
Right.
The longer term, if Japan succeeded in making it possible for women to stay in the workforce and have children, and adopted the most progressive childcare leave and childcare service programs, then he hoped that this would encourage families to have 2 or 3 children again, and that this would push up in the long term Japan's growth trajectory, very long term, when those additional babies became workers. But that hasn't worked at all. The fertility rate has fallen again to 1.36, and it's going in the wrong direction. And because I think that, people like Abe and other key male leadership figures in Japan have no idea what it's like to work in a Japanese organization with all those expectations and have all the responsibilities that are expected of mothers in Japan, even after these changes are put in place. And so what they really need is change the way Japanese people work, shorter hours, both men and women, having more flexible hours so that both of them can cycle in to be responsible when the kids have an emergency. And they're nowhere close to doing that.
On the immigration front, though, it looked like there were at least some baby steps in terms of opening up, but that does, again, there it seemed to have sputtered somewhat, or hasn't really achieved what was even originally intended, particularly, I think, in the healthcare and domestic management fields.
Yeah, there have been a lot of, during the 8 years he was in office, he did many different things that kind of tweaked immigration policy. So one of the first things he did was open up the opportunities for expats to bring their maids to Japan.
Yes.
But he didn't at the same time allow busy executives, let's say female executives working in Tokyo who are Japanese, they couldn't get a maid. This was only for expats. So that's very much of a halfway policy if you're taking this really seriously. There was a point system that was introduced early on that was supposed to allow particularly skilled workers to come in with more easily and eventually even become citizens of Japan. So that change legislation was pushed through, but not very many people signed up. And then finally, they created this category of unskilled workers, where they were supposedly going to be able to admit hundreds of thousands of workers that might go into jobs in the construction industry, in agriculture, or as maids or healthcare workers. Now, I shouldn't use the term unskilled for healthcare workers, but the lower skilled ends of the healthcare profession that are the ones who will look after older Japanese when the healthcare system really comes under strain of aging society. That's a major area of labor shortage Japan can see coming. And this system is supposed to allow in large numbers for 5 years at a time, potentially renewable. Eventually you can get married. So they tried to make it possible to a little more attractive. And then COVID came along. before they could implement it. And we don't really know how Japan will implement this new system.
Does that hew to the, how should I say, the characterization of Abe as a nationalist to some extent? Given that immigration kind of treads into that aspect of nationalism in Japan. I mean, was he a kind of nationalist figure? Was he someone who, I mean, a conservative, but was he using, and of course, the idea of altering the constitution is kind of entangled in that. Was he that kind of a figure?
I think if you asked almost any Japanese person how nationalist was Abe, you would see everybody rate him high on that character. He's thought of as a nationalist leader, but that is mostly for his position on security strategy.
And China, to large extent.
And to some degree. He certainly takes the China, the rise of China and the growing Chinese military power seriously. He thinks Japan needs to adapt its policies to deal with this challenge. And he wants to change the constitutional interpretation to allow Japan to prepare for that. And
the visits to Yasukuni Shrine, though, were certainly an indication of where he stood.
Yeah. So in terms of his policy changes during the time he was prime minister, the most important nationalist things he did were in the security policy area.
Right.
And they are things that in Japan get called nationalism, but in most other countries are called security policy. And both Democrats and Republicans support these kinds of things all the time. Now, going to Yasukuni Shrine is different, definitely. The Yasukuni Shrine is a place where war criminals are enshrined. There's a museum attached to this shrine that tells a very nationalistic version of Japan's imperial wars, and celebrates the imperial victories before World War II. And so the fact that Abe was willing to go there as a prime minister when he first came into office a second time was a statement that he's still committed to Japan's ability to honor its war dead, and he considers visiting Yasukuni Shrine necessary to show that Japan is a normal country and is not allowing other countries' complaints to get in the way of Japan being proud of its history. Okay, so that is, again, it's something that in most other countries is often done by people of all political persuasions. But in given Japan's history,
their sensitivity
and the sensitivities of its neighbors, it was a very in-your-face thing for him to do. And I'm sure he and his supporters continue to go to Yasukuni Shrine on a regular basis. He stopped going as prime minister after that one visit. And it did help restore communications with the Chinese. But it's still part of who he was, an important part of who he was, and gets him called a nationalist. Now, the part that are missing from this nationalist agenda are the anti-immigration rhetoric that you hear from Trump and many other populist, right-wing populist figures in Europe. And Abe does not say incendiary things in public about minorities. Because there isn't a whole lot of immigration, he doesn't have to say we need to stop immigration.
You don't have to build a wall.
We don't have to build a wall.
Right.
And so that has saved him maybe he would have done some of those things if Japan had larger numbers of immigrants. And I should say that within Japan, there is a hard right, especially on social media, and they're called the netto uyoku, the online right wing, that do talk about immigrants in the ways that we hear in the West. And some of these people also support Abe. So Abe gets charged with guilt by association for some of these pretty dangerous people who could, in some future date, go from the internet into the physical world in disturbing ways. So
Now,
it's something to watch.
Right. Now, Len, I'm mindful that we've gone quite a long time, and we frankly focused really on Abe the politician. We haven't even gone into things like all that much. We've mentioned the United States and China, but gone all that much into the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific, which of course would probably count along with CPTPP as his biggest legacy, if you will, its most important foreign policy legacy. So just to close, let's talk a bit about that. Well, the regional global significance of Abe Shinzo, which I think probably weighs very heavily on his successors, or will weigh kind of heavily on his successors, because that's where he seemed to hit his stride, as it were, having worked on the domestic agenda, and then that allowed him to some extent to be more robust in at least developing a more active, if not activist, kind of foreign policy.
Yes, I think that is going to be one of his important legacies, and it was very much assisted by the decision of President Xi to take a more aggressive line in Chinese foreign policy, and more recently by Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. So Abe was the person who had some stability in office, some longevity in office, and the background to step into an opportunity to exercise more regional leadership, to try to get the United States behind a vision that would involve multiple countries working together to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific.
He was the originator of that
he's
idea.
Very proud of this language, yes.
Right.
But key foreign policy advisors of his have been working for years to improve relations with Australia and India, and he was
ASEAN, right? As well.
Yeah, and ASEAN, and they were finally able to bring this together during his prime ministership into a coherent vision.
Right.
And I think it's and they eventually brought the Americans along as well. They keep having to pull them back from the Middle East or pull them back from Russia to keep them involved in this vision. But I think that the United States today, both Democrats and Republicans, have come to an agreement with Abe that a strategy of this kind is necessary to maintain the stability of East Asia. And I think it's preferable to America trying to deal with it on its own, the way it did for most of the Cold War. It's more realistic. But it is not at all easy to pull off strategy for the long term, because these countries have distinct interests and priorities. At the moment, the Koreans have a leader who is more aligned with this vision. The Australians,
the new president,
in sync. Yes. So Modi is fine, but we don't know in the long term that all these countries are going to be on the same page. So the strategy is somewhat vulnerable to disintegration at some key moment.
And the United States, not least, of countries that are at risk of. In fact, I feel that particularly with the midterm elections in the United States, that to some extent the United States is the clear and present danger, perhaps, in upsetting that kind of working relationships that have been to some extent revived under the Biden presidency, although one can debate about that. What have we lost with the death of Abe Shinzo, because he was making statements about Taiwan. He was making, he was still very active. I mean, he was anyway gunned down in the line of duty, as it were. He was actively campaigning for his party. And as you mentioned, I find it interesting that you were using the present tense still with
Yes.
Abe, because it's almost like he's still, there. He's still a presence. But you mentioned that he was only 67. He had possibly quite a number of years left, even though he had some ill health problems. What do you think we've lost? And is there anybody out there in Japan who might take up that mantle? I mean, particularly, there are quite a number of young leaders who are on the sidelines right now. Although Kishida-san has clearly scored big triumphs with the upper house election, so that he seems to be in a secure position right now.
Yeah, I caught myself too using the present tense there, and when I should have been using the past tense.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. And I think it's partly because for the immediate next several months, Abe was very involved in putting in place a train of things that are on Kishida's agenda, largely because Abe helped put them there. So one is a new security strategy that has to be announced by December. The new budget is supposed to reflect the Liberal Democratic Party's new commitment to reach 2% of GDP spending on defense within 5 years. That's brand new.
That's a kind of NATO-like commitment, isn't it?
Right. So as recently as a year ago, when they ran for in the general election for the lower house, they included the 2% goal in an appendix in the fine print, and they had it as a goal without a date. So within a year, partly because of what happened in Ukraine, and partly because Abe was using that to bring people along to making a firmer target that would bind Kishida and potential successors to a time-dated goal for increased defense spending. And since Japan has been only spending 1%, going to 2% is a huge increase for Japan. It's, still a smaller economy than China. It's 1% more on defense is not going to do anything very much to offset rising Chinese military spending that's happening at the same time. But it at least gives Japan some ability to purchase some specific weapon systems that it can use to carry out the kind of strategy that we were talking about. And that's on the agenda, the budget and the security strategy, and potentially constitutional revision. That does not have a time limit. And I can easily see Kishida saying, let's focus on these two things first before we talk about constitutional revision. But that's also hanging because the LDP ran this summer on a commitment to introduce constitutional revision legislation. So the ball is in Kishida's court to be the next major political figure within the LDP, because he doesn't have to face the voters for 3 years. He's got these decision opportunities in front of him that he could continue in the more assertive, I would use the word aggressive, not so much as sounding threatening as being bold in terms of pushing for change, which is not always the Japanese leadership style. So Kishida could do that with everything that's been teed up. But on the other hand, he has been historically a more hawkish, a dovish member of the LDP. He comes from a faction that produced Prime Ministers Miyazawa and Miyazawa and some other key figures who were more on the dovish side of the LDP.
Right.
He comes from Hiroshima, which experienced the nuclear bomb.
Is it Fukuda or one of the Fukuda? No, it wasn't.
No, Fukuda is in the lineage that
was in the
Abe.
Right. Was he in the Abe?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Now, when you mentioned this whole thing about this defense spending, I guess one should remember that, in fact, Donald Trump was all about trying to say that allies were free riding too much, and that he was pushing them in NATO, and also with regard to Japan and South Korea, that he wanted them to pay for their defense. So it's an interesting development there. Len, you're so generous with your time, and we've really gone way over my anticipated, but I think the conversation has been very rich. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't ask, because, for our listeners' benefit, you actually spent your youth, a good part of your, when you were young, in Japan. So you're there, you've been there a couple of months, and what are your own thoughts in terms of this kind of homecoming visit, and indeed, oddly, I guess, or capped by this really momentous event that will change Japan? Do you think that Abe Shinzo's assassination will in fact change this country that you know so well?
Yeah, I think it's especially because of the coronavirus having closed the country
Also,
to visitors like me for multiple years. I previously used to come almost every year, at least once. So I feel like I'm coming back, both as remembering my time as a child living here, but also filling in a gap of years, just learning on the ground how much things have changed. During most of my visits, the conversations were about how things like the Ukraine war are affecting Japanese strategy. And I have yet to wrap my mind around whether the passing of Abe is actually going to propel this any further than it was. I would characterize it as Abe having used the Ukraine situation and to put Japan in motion in a trajectory that would lead to additional significant changes in its ability to defend itself and carry out a security strategy like we've been talking about.
Yes.
But that's not foreordained, and I don't think it's going to push it faster than it would have gone if Abe had lived. I don't think that there is going to be a reaction that says, in honor of Abe, we need to go even further than he would have pushed us. And there's nothing about the particular circumstances of the murder, blaming, it's a little tempting to compare it to an event like 9/11. Certainly 9/11, the United States propelled US security in radically new directions and changed world history. And so it's tempting to think that an event like this, where Abe is assassinated, would result in similar radical change in policy. I don't see so far anything like that happening, because the nature of the murder seems so like a personal, strange circumstance, not any evidence of a new security threat to Japan. So that the main effect is to remove Abe from the scene.
Right.
And if anything, that may create an opportunity for Kishida to slow things down if that's what he wants to do.
I think I think you tweeted about this, that the resilience of Japanese democracy and Japanese politics, in its way, was quite evident that after a short pause, you did see candidates for the upper house election back out on the hustings with pretty much the same kind of security they've always had, which is pretty minimal. And that the candidates are right there, mano a mano, face with the people, and the people are within touching distance practically of these candidates, and that was in many ways a testament to the sobriety of the reaction. The great sorrow, but there is a certain amount of sobriety and resiliency in the Japanese political system, in Japanese society.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great summary of my reactions to seeing how the campaign played out in the final day after the assassination. And the reporting on the funeral yesterday also emphasized how little security there was, given the number of people milling around and people in close proximity, large proportion of the cabinet and other important people there. And so they are not treating this as a national security threat that that Japan needs to suddenly reorient its policy around. It doesn't have much to do on gun policy to make the country safer. It's already done just about all it can. There is some interest in making sure that manufacturing your own guns does not become something that's easy to do.
Right.
So yeah, that's about all that I can see from the direct assassination effect of on the policy.
Well, Len, it's always wonderful to chat with you, and over the years, and certainly now, very rich conversation. I know we've gone way longer than one of our normal podcasts. We're probably hitting the record at this point with our podcast. So thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to see you, and I hope we get to see each other in person before long.
I hope so. Thanks,
So,
Al.
thanks very much.